Climate change. Once COVID is finally suppressed, we'll soon realise that this is the biggest challenge we face. The world is waking up and taking action, with country after country lining up to legislate and act for net zero emissions by the middle of this century, as the Paris Agreement in 2015 necessitated. So all of us, individuals, businesses, governments, are doing what we need to do to achieve the decarbonisation of the economy. The way we travel, the way we eat, the way we consume stuff, all this will have to change. How will bill payers and taxpayers afford to pay for the changes we need? Can we afford not to? And are current plans by the government through their 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution enough? As we approach the year of COP26, the UK is hosting, we asked Natalie, Ross and Alexander, is government greenery too little, too late? If you want to ask questions, you've got the Slido link on the YouTube link. Please use the code BrightBlueTV, and that's the hashtag for Twitter too. So first to Alexander, what will happen if we don't do the deep decarbonisation that we've now legislated for?
Well, there's two ways to look at that. If we break the law, well, that won't be very good. I'm sure we've been taken to court about it, and our international standing will be bad. If we don't do it, evidence is clear that carbon emissions will increase or not decrease fast enough, and that will put us in an environmental catastrophe that will have huge costs. And if we don't do it, we're going to miss out on the huge economic and jobs boom that's going to come from legislating it. And to me, that is the most important thing. Whenever I talk about these sort of issues, I always look at the potential and the advantage we have of carrying out a low carbon future. And that to me is about jobs and investment. The whole world is going low carbon or net zero. If we get there at the head of the pack and develop new technologies, new financial models, new ways of getting there, then we can export those expertise across the world. People can buy the expertise from us, and we can have a huge impact on our economy, as well as doing the right thing for the planet and for ourselves.
So Ross, when people talk about climate change, they say we need to stop catastrophic climate change from happening. Is it a catastrophic thing in your mind?
I don't see it as catastrophic, no, but I don't have a problem with the aspiration to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It's quite a perfectly reasonable aspiration. What I do have the problem is where it becomes legally binding. We've made it legally binding on ourselves in a way that China and the US are not going to do. They're not going to constrain their economies in this way. And if we're going to get to decarbonize industries such as iron, steel, and steel cement, which are big emitters of carbon, we don't have the scaled up commercial technology yet to do that, to achieve that. And it seems to me madness to set a target when we don't actually know how we can achieve that, or whether if we can achieve that. And the other big problem is that the target which we've set ourselves under the Climate Change Act is pretty meaningless because it covers territorial emissions only. And, that's carbon physically spewed out within the United Kingdom. It doesn't include aviation, it doesn't include international shipping, and most importantly of all, it doesn't include emissions spewed out elsewhere in the world in the name of making consumer goods for British consumers. And if you exclude all those, well, you create a situation where government can get fixated on this 2050 target and the other targets it set in advance of that. And all that happens is we just offshore our emissions. We export our steel industry, we export cement, we export all manufacturing industry, we import electricity to no net benefit of the globally at all. We've just ruined our own economy for no benefit.
Okay, so there's a skepticism there with a kind of legal target. I suppose, Natalie, you're skeptical, but in the sense that it's not ambitious enough. You want the date moved forward.
Very much so. But I think to pick up a couple of things that Ross just said, I mean, I actually put that very point about consumption emissions. I've been putting it regularly to the government, and indeed I put it to the Committee on Climate Change with a briefing they had for peers. And of course, they pointed out that, as Alexander has already said, the rest of the world is racing to net zero as well. So if we are importing things, I want us to make many more things here in the UK. I want us to grow much more of our own food. But if we are importing things and everyone else is racing to net zero, then the emissions, those consumption emissions, are also very much going down. And the point about the legal target, I think one of the problems, one of the reasons why we're doing this is there is a profound distrust of politics in the UK, stronger than in many other parts of the world. And, if a Scandinavian country says they're going to do something, they have a political system that really has a track record of delivering on that. The UK government, I would say the US government too, don't have that track record. But in terms of the need for more speed, I'd pick up on the points that Alexander was making in terms of, more speed means we're more ahead of the game. We're getting in there. We have a historic, a lot of the historic emissions up there because we were the first country to industrialize are our responsibility. So we have a moral responsibility, but there's also a real benefit from actually going faster. And I also would pick up what you said at the start, Ryan. Once we've dealt with COVID, we've got to face on this. I would put the two things together. I mean, COVID is in part a result of our destruction of the natural world, where the nature crisis very much related to the climate crisis.
Can we unpick that a bit? What do you mean by that? Why is COVID caused by climate change crisis?
Well, I was focusing on the nature crisis specifically rather than the climate crisis, although actually the climate crisis is also a health crisis. But basically what we've got, and this is what all the scientists say, this is not at all controversial, is because we're destroying the natural world, we're putting people and livestock in closer contact with the natural world. We are seeing more pandemics, more threats of pandemics, more dangerous viruses, particularly evolving. Also the problem of antimicrobial resistance with factory farming. We are creating a more dangerous situation for human health because of the way we're treating the natural world.
So Alexander, just this, Natalie obviously wants to be a lot more ambitious than 2050. What is the effect of, say, bringing the net zero target? The Labour Party were talking a decade earlier, I think, in their manifesto. Surely that's a good thing. Or what happens if you go too quick?
Yeah, the two things really we've got to, it's got to weigh up. We've always got to go where the science technology leads us. I think if we can get to low carbon as quickly as possible, that is great, but we have to do it in a way that is not going to damage our industry, our economy. And I'm not saying it will damage it, but we have to retool our industry and our economy. And that's why actually I do disagree with Ross about the legal target. I think a target is essential. And why is it essential? Because it sends a clear message to business. They have to get their house in order and start investing in technologies. If there's no certainty, if it's some sort of nefarious target we get at some point, it's not going to make business think, because business will always deal with the law, and they will follow what the law says. If they know there's a clear target, it's like Brexit. If you know there's going to be the end of transition period at the end of January, you're going to prepare yourself for that. And if you think, oh, keep going on and on and on and have, and get more sort of conversations, you're not going to retool your business. And likewise with the green economy, you need to make sure that have a target to actually force you to actually do that and actually make businesses accept they have to do something, put the plans in now. Now, if you bring it forward too fast, then a lot of businesses will frankly struggle or to do it quickly enough. But I think we have to be realistic. These targets are movable. And if you look at the ban on new sales of passenger and electric diesel, that has been brought forward very recently. And we had a wider target. Clearly, the adaptation of people taking up electric vehicles and also the technology around charging, rather safe for batteries, means we can bring that target down. So I'd like to see that target come down, but I want to do it once we've looked at the science and also the evidence that we are moving quickly enough.
Alexander, in your intro, it was a sort of win-win, this whole decarbonisation agenda, good for the environment, good for the economy. Are there difficult choices that we are going to face? I mean, you talk about electric vehicles, for example. I mean, it's still the case, isn't it? The upfront price for an average EV new is higher than the equivalent model for a ICE vehicle, fossil fuel vehicle. So, are there costs for bill payers and taxpayers with this, or is it all completely a kind of win-win?
I don't think we've got to be sensible. There's always going to be winners and losers, frankly, of any technological change or any new development. But in my view, of all the evidence I've seen, there'll be more winners than there are losers when it comes to the economy. The amount of new jobs created by this, the amount of new technologies being created. You mentioned electric cars, and yes, at the moment, a like-for-like electric vehicle, new Victor, it's slightly more expensive than diesel, but it's only slightly more, and that has massively come down in the last 5 years. And as more and more electric vehicles are made and produced and charged, the cost of scale come massively down. And for instance, one thing I'm doing a lot of work on, which we know is hydrogen. Hydrogen is another alternative we have when it comes to low carbon vehicles, is buses. Now, at the moment, a hydrogen bus, which produces no emissions, is more expensive than a diesel bus. Now, looking at the modelling, if the government or if anyone orders 4,000 buses, hydrogen buses, which actually is a lot of buses, but not huge when it comes to how many buses are in this country, there'll be cost parity with diesel buses. So if you order them at scale, costs come down. So the more people that adopt the technology, the more jobs be created and the lower the costs. And what's more,
so, I mean, Ross, do you buy this, that it's, everybody is going to, see this to be a kind of affordable transition, or do you worry about the costs that might be incurred on bill payers and taxpayers?
Well, I think there is a very big danger. I mean, it's very easy for people to say, oh, we'll adopt this technology, we'll adopt that technology. But what we got to avoid doing is imposing huge costs on the poor, on low income groups, which are not then imposed on higher income groups. And I mean, an example of this is the Climate Change Committee wants to, its recommendations from its 6th carbon budget last week, recommended that all houses would have to be brought up to grade C level in an energy performance certificate within 10 years. And if they didn't reach that by 2028, just 8 years' time, well, the sale of any house with less than a C rating would be banned. Now, if you think of the implications for that on millions of homeowners, it costs a lot of money to insulate a house, insulate a solid wall house, install heat pumps and that sort of thing that you'd need to get to grade C. You'd be imposing a bill of thousands and thousands on millions of homeowners and then telling them, well, you can't even sell your house if you...
But Ross, that would be true if there's no other support to help you insulate your home. The Green Home Grant, the various grants out there exactly to challenge that. Because of course they have costs, and that's why the government is rightly stepping in to subsidise and help people get to that. And yes,
although totally inadequately. I mean, that's where coming back to our question of is the government going fast enough? 2 billion, compares to, I actually have a written answer from Lord Callanan, the minister, the Bay's minister, saying yes, we know that there has to be 64 billion spent by the end of the decade on home energy efficiency. But I want to actually come back to the electric car point, which is, I entirely agree with what Alexander said about cost. And I mean, that's certainly what we've seen with both solar and offshore wind. The prices have fallen far faster than anyone was predicting. But I think also, when we're talking electric cars, and more generally, what I'm talking about, the sort of transformation I'm talking about, is not just business as usual with added technology. An electric car takes up on exactly the same amount of space on the road. We have a huge congestion problem. They produce the same amount of PM 2.5s, particulate matter, very dangerous, from their tires and their brakes. So what we're talking about is, instead of everyone replacing their fossil fuel car with a electric car, we're looking at vastly greater use of car clubs, vastly greater use of shared cars. That also has lots of other positive benefits in terms of, we've created a thoroughly miserable society. We've packed our cities with cars which sit still for more than 90% of the time. It's incredibly wasteful of resources, incredibly wasteful of space. You look at Ghent, for example, where they've essentially got cars out of the city centre. Some of those car spaces are now children's playgrounds. Getting what we've had, COVID has exposed rather than caused, revealing just how poor, how our quality of life, the nature of our society, how fragile, how much poverty stricken, how much mental health problems there are. We need to build something different, and that's much better.
Natalie, so you talk about increased spending. You obviously feel the government needs to spend much more on this agenda. But is increased spending always leading to better outcomes? So I think of, for example, the Green Homes Grant. The take-up is quite low. And I remember the Green Deal, which the coalition government brought in, which was meant to provide loans for people to do energy efficiency. The take-up was very low. So is increased spending always leading to better outcomes?
Well, And sadly, under this government, and indeed previous governments, no, because the quality of administration. I mean, if you look at how this was brought in, the Green Homes Grant, sudden land from Mars announcement, and it's all got to be spent in 6 months, and you've got to go through this incredibly complicated bureaucratic procedure. And I actually know a builder in Sheffield that I've been asking questions prompted by that builder, because basically all of the people who certify the builders have suddenly got totally swamped. We've also got a huge amount of homes on the market, and so then the government eventually realised this was totally undeliverable and now added another 12 months to it, and that's after a decade when not a single penny of government money has been spent on home energy efficiency. What we need are stable long-term policies. It would have been about 2014. I was at the Construction UK annual industry gathering, and they were basically winding down the whole industry because they'd had the green homes money from the Labor government, which had just run out, and scores of businesses were closing. Thousands of people no longer had a job, expert people. We lost all of that because government policy has been like that. And that's where we come back to our first past the post electoral system. Our seesaw political decision making is a disastrously poor method of governance.
So Ross, I mean, Natalie talked about, a lot of the way that the economy and society works at the moment is, uncomfortable and impractical and inconvenient, massive amount of congestion enters. Some of the green stuff, we talk about it being impractical and heavily costly, but, the way that you heat your homes will be warmer, maybe easier, cleaner air if you travel in low emission vehicles. I mean, there's some good stuff, right? Not only in terms of decarbonisation, but the way you live your life. If you're cycling more and walking more, some of this stuff is also just makes you more happy, right?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with Natalie saying, congestion in cities, we've created miserable environments there. We have done, she's quite right. And, the way of getting around a city should be on foot or on some kind of public transport, not in a private vehicle, which then has to be parked somewhere, which then creates land use pressure for parking cars and so on. I agree with that totally, but that's not really a climate. That's not really part of the climate debate. We can, that we need to do that anyway. I mean, there are lots of things. I mean, I'm not against warm homes. I'm not against better insulated homes, electric cars. I mean, all these things are good from all kinds of ways. But if you create a target, you say we're going to get zero carbon by this date, then you impose this vast cost on, and it's the retrofitting that really is going to cost the money. I've no problem saying new homes have to be built to a certain standard. That's relatively easy, but it's telling people, you have to change everything. You have to change your lifestyle, and that's going to cost you thousands of pounds. And going back to the point of the insulation and what the Climate Change Committee was recommending. By the way, the chief executive of the Climate Change Committee made it quite clear that he saw that the costs would fall on homeowners. He didn't see it as a matter of central government putting up the billions of pounds that would be required. So yeah,
it doesn't necessarily have to come from the government. I mean, I've been to some interesting events talking about green finance, and in other countries there are really innovative ways in which you can basically have it's attached to the property like council tax, and so you pay it off very slowly at very low interest rates.
Well, that was the idea of the Green Deal, wasn't it? But the trouble with the Green Deal is that they found the energy improvements were so expensive that the energy savings weren't going to cover the costs of the loans on them.
Well, these things, it's so many other things. You look around the world, these things work in other countries. If we get the delivery right, they're certainly deliverable. And that's what we've got to do is, we have done very, very poorly. I was once with a group of Scandinavian ambassadors talking about this, and one of them came out with a lovely undiplomatic outburst and said, "I've never been so cold as I've been in Britain." People just in other countries don't expect to be cold in buildings. That's just not the way it is. And it's not because they've got the heating cranked up enormously. It's just the building's properly built.
I'm going to take some questions now from the audience, which are coming in. So an anonymous person has said, why don't we start applying carbon tax to materials so that industry start focusing and driving down their costs for the benefit of all? benefit of all. So Alexander, maybe you want to comment on this. I mean, there's a big debate, isn't there, about a kind of industry-wide, sector-wide carbon tax.
Yeah,
Is that something that you support?
I mean, generally, the big debate between whether you need a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. And I mean, there's merits to both. My view, and the least disruptive to business, and I do want to emphasize, Ross, like what I want to do is least disruptive business, is emissions trading system is probably an easier way. They've already got the mechanics going, and they can make it happen. And the cost won't fall directly on the consumer as well. And that's quite an important thing. I think a carbon tax is easy to understand, but may hit some of the poorest the most. So
and just to confirm, because that was a kind of ongoing debate across different government departments, they've now chosen the emission trading scheme.
They have chosen the emission trading. I mean, personally, I want it a bit harder because it doesn't actually have that net zero in the main part of it, and that's what it should be. But I think that's probably a better way of doing it than a carbon tax. Let's be honest, I'm conservative. I'm not a big fan of taxes of any sort, so I'm against the carbon tax.
Okay, so Natalie, presumably you would be an advocate for a kind of sector-wide carbon tax, make it more simpler.
Very, very much so. Well, I would have a carbon tax applying to everything. And, you know, what you're actually doing is at the moment, there's the huge externalized costs that are being applied for all of us from the carbon emissions, you know, and many other environmental impacts of products we buy and use. And, you know, companies are profiting, and all of us are paying with a damaged planet. So yes, we should have that, but in terms of the just transition, the dealing with the poorest, I mean, what we had set up in our 2019 general election manifesto was we were looking, particularly at that time, the gilets jaunes in France were huge, and at that point, they were very upset because of the tax on fuel, but also because wealth taxes had been removed and it was inequality. You have to give people enough money to live, which people don't get now with our inadequate minimum wage, 0 hours contracts and everything. And so we were saying we take the money from the carbon tax and we put it into a universal basic income, and that's giving people security. So, there's a price to be paid, so no one is left absolutely struggling, absolutely destitute, absolutely desperate, as our current system leaves millions and millions of people.
So Ross, I mean, just this point about environmental taxes, because obviously, you come from a tradition which I presume is quite skeptical of raising taxation. But as government does need to tax something, would you be supportive of, say, lowering taxes on, work, for example, and increasing it on things which have negative externalities like carbon? Is that not something, considering that we have to raise tax from somewhere, that you would support?
I don't have a problem with putting taxes on sort of fuel and other dirty operations up to a point, as long as it's not sort of penalising any group of people too much. I have a bigger problem in a way, actually, with an emissions trading scheme, because I mean, the most enthusiastic people for that tend to be in the city, because it creates a huge amount of income for people trading this stuff, but it can have quite sort of perverse outcomes. If you count, we've had this with steel making, haven't we? I mean, I know that the steel works on Teesside, I mean, it closed for multiple reasons, but I mean, one of the pressures on that, I mean, the owners found that they could close down a steel works in Britain, Teesside, sell off the the carbon credits, and then move production to India, where you can spew out just as much carbon dioxide, but not have to buy the carbon credits. And I think it's all too easily, that kind of system can have perverse consequences like that.
And steel is a real measure of government failure, in terms of we export about 2/3 of our scrap steel off to quite dirty places. What we could be having is renewable powered arc furnaces around the country melting down that steel. And there's so much the government has failed to do in terms of policy to point us in the right direction.
So, I mean, just connected to what Ross was just saying, and this is really a question for Alexander, Jeff Buckley has asked, how do we avoid emissions just being offshored to other countries? This has happened before.
Yes, I mean, that is a huge issue, especially when it comes to industry. But one thing which is reassuring, that even China has now put in a low carbon target as well. So the whole world, as I said, is going to this low carbon area. But what we need to do is make sure that the products that we consume in this, renewable, the minerals, are actually low carbon as well. And not just low carbon, but also are dealt with in good human rights ways. I mean, quite at the moment, most of our lithium comes from the DRC, and that is absolutely horrific. And likewise, the cobalt. We need to actually open up, frankly, more reliable, better supply chains of critical minerals to get this going. I mean, there's a company down in Cornwall looking at Cornish lithium, looking at trying to get extracting lithium from Cornwall. And to me, that's what we need to be investing as a government, as people into a resilient and reliable supply chain that is not going to either offshore our emissions or offshore our any human rights abuses as well. I mean, you have to be very careful about that, because there's no point Britain going low carbon if either the rest of the world ignores it, or we go low carbon on the backs of people who are being abused and exploited in other countries. That is just not good enough. And that is why we need to look at the whole thing.
I have to very much agree with Alexander there. And I mean, I've got a piece out this morning on Green European Journal on Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghurs. And, there are huge issues. But one of the things I'm seeing right across the political spectrum is a real interest, if we do have some countries that freeload, and there probably will be some countries, and Russia comes to mind here, that there has to be taxes at the border to make up for the fact if the country isn't doing the right thing, if it's not heading in the right direction, then you're looking at tariffs or indeed total barriers when you're talking about human rights, to say you just cannot import things we can't import things made with slave labor.
I mean, one issue that comes up is, a lot of the CCC, Committee on Climate Change forecasts, rely on some technologies to deliver some of the work. So, for example, CCUS, carbon capture storage, to get us to net zero. But some of these technologies are quite nascent, including CCUS. And I think also about hydrogen, which is obviously being trialed, for example, in the heating of homes, and is being used particularly for kind of larger vehicles. But some of this stuff is still quite minor in the kind of wider ecosystem, and actually still quite nascent. Do you worry somewhat that we're relying on some technologies which may not?
I'm going to jump in there and say, actually, I disagree. I think it's the advantage. That's exactly why there's the economic boom, because there are these nice technologies which no country really has actually got dominance over. Like when it comes to batteries for EVs, China has 35% of the market. They've won that battle. But when it comes like hydrogen or CCUS, we can actually, in the UK, develop those technologies, put our expertise there. There was a debate yesterday in Westminster. We can actually get the first move advantage, and then we can have the economic benefits, because the whole world is relying on things like CCUS, hydrogen to answer some of those gaps which we can't fill yet. So if we actually develop technology quickly and efficiently, we can have a huge economic boom for our country. And that's why, to me, the green revolution is so exciting, because there's opportunities. We're always talking about levelling up and creating more jobs as a Conservative government. My next question is, or people's question is, where are these jobs coming from? And my answer is the new technologies, the new things that we can develop, just like we did the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago. We can do the same for the green technologies, and it's a win-win for everyone.
Well, Ross, I mean, I know you're sceptical of the kind of regulation and legislation, but that presumably is a kind of selling point for you, the kind of technology, innovation, capitalism. Surely that's a route that you would agree with for decarbonisation.
Well, so long that is, as we don't go back to the sort of 70s with the government sort of trying to pick winners in among the technologies. And, when you've got a sort of Wild West industries, where new things are coming out of the woodwork and proving themselves and so on, some people make a fortune, but it's very easy to lose a fortune as well. And I can all too easy to see a government losing a fortune by backing the wrong stuff rather than, getting it right. And, we know a lot of things are going to fall by the wayside. I mean, take hydrogen. I mean, hydrogen, of course, is not an energy source. We don't know, you can't mine it, you can't drill for it. It's just a carrier of energy. It may play a part, but we don't have at the moment a scaled up commercial way of producing hydrogen in a green way. We produce lots of hydrogen because it's in the part of the oil refining process, but at the moment it's produced by hydrocarbons and produces vast amounts of carbon dioxide. So, maybe will hydrogen play a part in the future? I don't know. It may do, it may not do, but I would be very worried I'm a bit concerned about the way that the government is bigging up hydrogen and saying, this is a great future. It may be a complete dead end.
So Natalie, I mean, one thing to think about, Alexander is very excited about the kind of opportunities for economic growth and for market activity. But I think you come from an intellectual tradition which is quite skeptical of those things. So, I mean, presumably you support the green agenda for environmental reasons, but if it's going to kind of facilitate growth, perhaps you'd be skeptical of that because you want the kind of zero growth model. We're too reliant on growth in your mind.
Well, very much so. And a growth economy has produced all of what I was setting out before about how disastrously unequal and unstable our society is. But sort of to go back to you, I'm going to agree with you, Ryan, about carbon capture and storage. I'm deeply skeptical about carbon capture and storage. And what the Committee on Climate Change and other projections aren't really allowing for is actual social change. And, things like a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay involves less movement, less office space. And we've seen with COVID how fast social things can change, the sudden shift to move to home in a couple of weeks. So what I'm looking at, I'm very keen on jobs, opportunities, things like home energy efficiency, things like huge development of food growing, particularly fruit and vegetables, market garden crop setups in the UK. And there's huge numbers of jobs in those, and they're not focused on technology. They're focused on meeting people's basic needs as locally as possible. And what that's doing is building up strong local economies in which money goes round and round, built on small businesses and cooperatives. That's our economic model. That's what we're looking towards. And, the technology, some of it's extra, and I'll share some of Ross's skepticism about hydrogen in the sense that I think hydrogen makes sense as a store for when you have, when the wind's blowing really strongly and the sun's shining really hard, you store it. But whether that just is what you use for, big vessels, big HGVs, I'm somewhat skeptical about whether it's really the way to go for home heating. But what we're talking ultimately is a very different kind of economic model, not one that sees a few people making massive profits and everyone scrambling for the crumbs, but an economic model where every community is prosperous. I talk about rather than leveling up, I talk about spreading out, and that's what our economy desperately needs. Speaking to you from Sheffield, the perspective of Northern England, that's desperately what's needed, is strong local economies and businesses in every community in the land. And technology doesn't deliver that, doesn't work that way.
So let's come to an end, but just if there's one thing that you think the government should be doing more on to help decarbonisation, what would it be? So Alexander, if you were the new Bayes secretary and COP26 president, not that you're aiming to get Alex's job, if you were, what would you do? What would you be pushing for?
I would be more of a messaging thing and slay the sort of dragon that both Ross and Natalie has mentioned. Ross earlier mentioned about changing your lifestyle. Natalie talked about different economic models. I don't agree with any of that. I just think it's going to be pretty much the same, but better. We're all going to be driving cars at the same probably rate as they do before, but they'll be better cars. We're all going to live in the same sort of homes we live now, but they're better homes. We're all going to having jobs, high quality jobs, in manufacturing, but they'll be better quality jobs. We're all going to be using the same model. So actually, for the average consumer, it's not going to make too much difference to your lifestyle, apart from increasing progressive improvements when it comes to technology and skills and financial side of it. So it's not going to be this complete change of how we live our lives at all. We're just going to carry on and live a better life. And don't be scared. It's a great opportunity.
Ross, how would you make the green agenda better?
Well, I think we've been talking for half an hour about reducing carbon emissions to zero. Well, so that's one way of sort of approaching the problem. The other problem we haven't talked about at all is adaptation. And it seems to me, whether or not temperatures rise in line with the forecasts, the models, which I'm rather skeptical of generally, we need to defend ourselves against rising sea levels. Sea levels been rising with sort of 3 millimeters a year and so on. And I don't see any action on that scale, that side of things, anything like to match the government's program on cutting carbon emissions. I'd look at the problem myself. The first thing I think, well, why aren't we building barrages across the Bristol Channel, across the Thames estuary and so on, which are not only flood defences, but would also give us vast amounts of zero carbon energy. And we cannot on our own reduce carbon emissions and stop climate change in that sense. We cannot do it on our own because we only account for 1 or 2% of global carbon emissions. Adaptation has got to be a big part of this story. And it seems to me the governments are virtually ignoring that side of things.
Okay, so more on adaptation, not just mitigation. Natalie?
Well, I'm going to agree with Ross that we vastly need more adaptation, although the answer is not building more walls, building more concrete, but actually looking at our land use. And I'll focus on that because my top number one would be home energy efficiency, but I've already talked a lot about that. But we have a countryside that's basically been turned to concrete the way we manage our land. And we've even got things like, the Telegraph got very excited yesterday because we might finally get a peat strategy, something that the Committee on Climate Change and all the experts have been saying, and the government's been promising for years, we might finally get some action on a peat strategy, stop burning our uplands. So we need to entirely change the way we manage the land. And that's also an important adaptation as well as mitigation factor. And that means, trees is the obvious thing, agroforestry, growing much more fruit trees. It's utterly changing what our landscape looks like. And what that does also is, I've mentioned the nature crisis. Climate emergency is only one of the environmental threats that face us. Britain is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We're incredibly poor in nature. And so this is, for climate adaptation, mitigation, and for nature, we need to entirely change the way we treat the countryside. And the government ELMS, environmental land management schemes, is way too slow, way too uncertain, and is tending to be focused on looking after small bits of the countryside and trashing the rest for industrial agriculture. We need to share nature, food production, and climate action right across our countryside.
Great, good stuff. Thank you to all of you for speaking, and thank you for everybody at home who's watching. Look out for forthcoming Bright Blue reports, one on how we mature the market in electric vehicles, the other in how we can reform UK export finance so it's more aligned with our net zero goals. Obviously, the government recently announced that it was banning UK from financing fossil fuel projects overseas, but we feel there's more that can be done, so watch out for that. But thank you very much to Natalie, Ross and Alexander, and Merry Christmas, everyone.